Welcome to Siliconsciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome to Siliconsciousness. This week, as every week, we're going to talk about some of the most important issues in AI and how AI is affecting some of the things we're most concerned about. I'm David Rothkopf. I'm your host. And this week, we're joined by Dr. Susan Ariel Aaronson. She is a research professor of international affairs at the George Washington University Elliott School. And there she also serves as the director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub. How are you today?
I'm very worried. So I'm okay.
Talk to us. You can view this as a therapy session if you like.
Okay. Well, I just hosted a webinar on digital sovereignty, and one of the speakers, the two speakers had just published a book with Cambridge University Press about the implications of data sovereignty and digital sovereignty for AI. And so here you had a Brazilian professor from FGV Law School and a Chinese American professor at UNC. And basically, they were pleading for people to understand that they need to take control of their destiny and break the habits of either state-sponsored surveillance, which is the business model underpinning much of Chinese AI, and corporate-sponsored surveillance, the business model underpinning much of US AI. I think AI is public good, but it is also a general purpose technology, which means that it is going to significantly impact a wide range of sectors and economic health of the United States and the world as a whole. And finally, it's a dual-use technology. So a dual-use technology is a technology that's essential to military progress and economic progress. And how do you govern that? That's pretty tough. And I don't think any nation knows how to do it. And the United States just made things worse because we sent a signal that AI would not be governed and anything goes. And that's terrifying.
So let's talk about that. What do you mean we sent a signal? How did we do that?
Well, we, meaning our Emperor Trump, right? He sent the signal. He doesn't like anything that Biden did. So the executive orders on AI, which were deliberately designed to make the US government a model of how AI could be used and funded and shared. And it was far from perfect, but that executive order told market actors that you should try to have a participatory approach to AI. You should try to be as transparent as possible about the models. Open source models are not inherently bad or risky, but they do present risks. And it's basically said that when the US government uses AI, it will be transparent about what programs it uses and work to ensure that that AI is not discriminatory and not dangerous. And Trump changed his executive order, basically says that the only thing that matters is US competitiveness in AI. So safety doesn't matter. Trying to get rid of bias doesn't matter. Trying to design AI in a way that reflects the needs of the population as a whole. Having accurate, complete, and representative data doesn't matter. Having hallucinations doesn't matter.
Yeah, well,
So,
yeah, et cetera, et cetera. So, but let's pick up on that. I wanted to go back and talk to you a little bit about an article that you had written about, your expectations for Trump AI policy, and I will do that in a minute. But the Trump administration has started, and we have already seen a couple of things that impact what you were just talking about, which is our competitiveness generally and our competitiveness with regard to AI. So, a couple of things strike me. One of the things, as you said, he did was he got rid of the executive order on AI. But he's also planning to and by the time people listen to this, he will have done already, launch trade wars around the world to increase tariffs, which is going to have an impact on U.S. competitiveness. That's going to also result in retaliation. That could have an impact on this area. And at the same time, he seems to be inclined to stop funding certain kinds of core research in the United States, which can't help with AI competitiveness. So, although he speaks he talks the talk about competitiveness, he does seem to be sending mixed signals. Do you agree with that?
I more than agree with it. I cannot stand conspiracy theorists, but I think "Make America Great Again" is an Orwellian um, turn of phrase to essentially weaken the United States. And when you can't have trust in your institutions and in the technologies that American companies develop and disperse, that is a very dangerous thing. Without guardrails, American products won't be trusted, and American companies will not be building the infrastructure for, let's say, Brazil or Indonesia, huge markets that we should very much care about. So his AI policies undermine competitiveness. Moreover, at the end of the Biden administration, David, you may be familiar with the notion of digital solidarity. And the idea was, instead of like saying, we're the best, you have to go with us, let's find ways to work with other countries to build AI, right? Because AI at bottom is a global product. It's built on the world's data, it's built on the world's expertise. And so, how do you do that? You do it best by working in concert with other nations and finding common grounds and listening to them. But Trump doesn't listen to anybody, so that's
Well,
unfortunate.
well, that's true. Although I'm an equal opportunity critic here, and let's go back and deal with some of these Biden administration things because they've also been called into question recently. The Biden administration had a policy with regard to AI that was, I think you've referred to it as AI nationalism, which was essentially, look, we this is zero sum game with China. We have to keep them from getting AI. We're going to get AI. We're going to have better AI. The world will march towards our better AI, and then we can set terms for them that allow them to get the chips that they want and small yard, high fence, etc. That was never going to work. I mean, let's be clear: the technology is everywhere, and the Chinese are very innovative. And one of the examples of that we've seen, of course, in the past week is the recent flurry of interest in DeepSeek, a Chinese technology, which essentially was built, and we don't know all the details, but was built in part, at least, as a workaround for these AI policies of the U.S. And it said we're not going to be chip centric; we're going to be software centric, and we're going to come up with something that'll be cheaper to build. And all of a sudden it revealed this kind of core flaw in the Biden administration logic, which is most of the world is perfectly happy with just good enough AI. They don't need the state of the art. They're not going to negotiate with us. If they can have just good enough AI without strings attached and cheaper, they're going to take it because they want to be part of this revolution. And so I think a lot of the assumptions that they made were wrong. And we're now in an era where we're seeing that that's wrong. And the question is going to be for the Trump administration, which has this very interesting relationship with leaders in the tech world that you've written about, whether we're going to adapt to that reality or we're going to be held back by political dogma.
Well, when you worked at the Department of Commerce many years ago,
Yeah, back in the Hoover
I think that was the
administration.
time after competitiveness. But to me, the whole competitiveness thing was essentially about America in terms of economics needs a competitor. We need the blue team or the black team or whatever to compete with us to keep ourselves on our toes. And so, just as Meta kind of learned from that in 2017 when Mark Zuckerberg had dinner with Trump, he said basically, we're very threatened by TikTok and we're very threatened by Chinese companies' expertise in AI. At the same time that Meta, Microsoft, et cetera, all had significant research centers in China because there's a lot of great AI research being done in China by Chinese scholars and Chinese researchers. And so I agree with you that the thesis has been proven wrong. And the thesis is that, we deserve federal support because we need this to compete and we need to support semiconductors. We need to make it here and we need to support shared infrastructure. And there have been several threats to that. Threat number one is that, other countries want their own AI infrastructure and they want to be able to control their cloud. That's the whole cloud sovereignty movement. And the Biden administration with export controls took a bullying approach instead of the digital solidarity approach we just talked about related to the infrastructure. Okay, so that was one wrong assumption. The other assumption about the process of distillation of models and how China was able to create a logic model and a large language model that, is as good as a proprietary closed source AI model. So the United States made some real mistakes there. I think that we didn't do sovereignty enough. You may be familiar with the idea of the National AI Research Resource, which was an idea of Fei Li and other professors at Stanford who said, listen, no university can afford the GPUs and we can't teach the best AI computer science if we don't have access to the fastest infrastructure. And I thought they should take the infrastructure and the data sets that the NIR is supposed to contain and internationalize it, just as the United States helped to do that with the internet. But that hasn't happened. The United States should return to the notion that this is a public good. It would be commercialized. American companies will do very well, but we should share. And if we share, that'll keep us on our toes. I'm sorry, I'm not a market fundamentalist, but that's my gut. My own research is on AI overcapacity. And basically my argument is because AI is a public good, a general purpose technology, and a dual-use technology. Every middle income and industrialized nation thinks it has to have its own AI. And what we're going to end up with is too much AI. And that is a huge problem because AI is increasingly dumped and AI is increasingly garbage. So we've come full circle in the discussion. I think there's too much AI and there's a lot of junk AI, or as you put it, good enough AI.
Well, another thing that's interesting to me about it, as you referred to, I was a trade official once upon a time in like the, Martin Van Buren administration, but, I still remember some, discussions about this stuff. And, from 1945 to 1999 or a little bit beyond there, the world was engaged in this issue of a globalizing economy and how do you come up with trade laws for a globalizing economy. And, a lot of that was driven by big companies for their own self-interest. But there was a point that they had that, I mean, I don't think the U.S. adjusted, dealt with the disruptions that globalization causes properly, right? But there was a point, and the point is, if you're a company and you're global and you want to get to scale and you want to offer things cheaply, and that's obviously important when it comes to certain kinds of public goods, it's really helpful not to have 200 different regulatory regimes. And that, with regard to AI and with regard to a lot of digital trade and tech, we were kind of in the early days of dealing with that before we got to AI. Now, here is AI, which is a technology that is not like, prior technology, because it changes every technology. It changes medical research. It changes warfare. It changes finance. It changes labor. It changes economic issues and so forth. There's going to be dozens and dozens of regulatory regimes within each country that then have to be harmonized. And to me, from the trade nerd point of view, this is the big game, right? This is the big trade game going forward. And I think a key question is the US ready to engage in that game or not?
So I sit on a National Academy of Sciences board, which tries to encourage open science and data governance of open science. And the United States, during the Reagan administration, even then, the United States government restricted certain information. And I don't mean for national security reasons. I mean because it did not want to share certain types of data. So today, the United States is not credible because increasingly it restricts access to public data. That happened during the Biden administration, and sensitive personal data. Why? Because you and I cannot anticipate how companies can use that data, or governments, to manipulate us. And so the United States has moved away from its traditional support, with those exceptions I listed before, of the free flow of data. That has huge implications for science and competitiveness, which I don't think, I'm sorry to diss them, but they don't get at all. And we are all better off if you want to have good AI, you have to have as accurate, complete, and representative data as possible. No one can do that because something like 34% of the world's population are not online. So they're not heard or seen on the internet. But in 1997, the United States put out a document called the Global Framework for E-Commerce. And the Global Framework for E-Commerce should be relevant today, which is you need to set shared rules regarding the governance of personal data to build trust. And that means protecting personal data from theft, but it also means manipulation. We blew it. We let companies adopt a business model that was not built on trust. Huge implications for, trust in our models. But we're never going to have good AI if we don't have the most accurate, complete, and representative data sets. The way to get there is through digital trade agreements or some sort of shared framework. We are really far from that. Ironically, since the Biden administration did no digital trade agreements, none, and really stepped back from a belief in that trade agreements set rules that Americans can benefit from because they give Americans a voice in Mexico or El Salvador or wherever, and start to share norms. I'm sorry, I'm still a believer that trade is a good thing. I think the Trump administration will negotiate digital trade agreements, but they'll be garbage. They will be like what was in NAFTA 2.0. And its digital trade provisions say nothing about AI, and maybe they shouldn't, but they really say very little about the free flow of data.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I agree that Biden administration didn't actually do trade policy. It was a kind of a void. This administration will be more interesting, and that's what I want to get to in a second. But when I hear discussions like this, and you talk about digital trade policy, and you talk about data, I can't help but bring up one of my own personal bugaboos, which is how do you talk about data when we don't have any philosophical underpinning for what it is, right? So in other words, and by philosophical I mean political philosophy, economic philosophy, and so forth. So, for example, every company in the world has giant data asset. No accounting firm knows how to account for that asset. No market knows how to evaluate that asset. There are
No, it's not
liabilities.
completely ungoverned because the SEC has rules saying that cybersecurity is material to the health of the
No,
company,
no,
and
I
so
understand, but
so
but but
so so there is a sense that data is both an asset and a liability, right? Um,
I agree with that, but I'm just saying I don't think people know how to evaluate it. If we
yeah,
live in a world of big data, having lots and lots and lots of data is theoretically a valuable thing. We don't know how to evaluate it. We also don't understand ownership, right, of the data. I mean, that's the argument around a lot of the large language models and where they're training themselves is like, who who owns, the originator of the data, the capturer of the data, the interpreter of the data, you know, how do you build legal agreements unless you know the answer to the foundational questions?
except that here's the thing. It's really interesting. A while back, I wrote a paper and I looked to see which nations had national data strategies. And by that, I mean the role of data in the polity, right? And the economy. So it's not just that it is an asset, but data can be used to manipulate. And if you want to know a government that has done this right, it would be Germany. And I'd be pleased to share with you Germany's data strategy, which they changed, but Germany and Switzerland wrote national strategies. They sought public comment on it. No one really comments, but how should we think about data and how should data be governed? Because data is what is underpinning all these new technologies. And if you don't have access to that data, or have rules governing how and when it can be shared and who owns it and who's liable if that data is stolen or misused. For example, spreading rumors about a person. The legal system is starting to evolve this. And unfortunately, I agree with you, it's a patchwork, but it needs to start with a national strategy. And that ain't going to happen in the Trump administration. I'm sorry, I don't see thoughtful people who are really thinking about the multiple roles of data. But data is something weird and it's different from a good and it's different from a service because it is both a good and a service. It's plentiful and precious. It's really hard for people to understand. But one thing that they do understand, I think, even young people who didn't grow up with a notion of privacy, they share things online that perhaps people who are over 40 might not do or 50 might not do. So I do think we're starting to see greater consciousness that if it's personal data, individuals and groups need greater control over that type of data because it can be used to manipulate you. And let me just give one example. So a lot of people like playing games in virtual reality headsets or, using augmented reality. And when they emerge from the game, they have a hard time going from what is virtual back into the real world. But some of the behaviors slip into that. And women have reported being molested when they're online. And that might seem truly weird to you, but you can be molested through your avatar, through sensory perceptions. And if you think the amount of data that we use for AI is a lot, wait until you get to AI augmented virtual reality and where sensors are constantly monitoring your eye blinks, your sweat, your pulse, etc. So I think there will be a movement to sort of, haven't seen much of it yet. There is a little bit of this in a group called Radical Exchange and groups that are trying to create data trusts to collectivize control over data. You see more of it in countries like the UK and Norway and Germany. The United States is behind the times in that regard, but I think it's a coming.
Yeah, I think it's coming too. And, I think no matter what one thinks of Democrats or Republicans or Biden or Trump or Kamala Harris or anybody else, the next administration, the one that we've got now, is going to do more with AI than the last one because there's more issues that are emerging around that. Um, and there's an interesting conundrum at the heart of this. And I think our conversation could go on, and perhaps we can continue it at some other time. We've only got a few minutes left. But one of the things that you talked about in your article that I think is exactly right and misunderstood because people get head up about politics is that Trump is surrounded by a bunch of data bros who don't agree on this. They have different views. And so Elon Musk may think one thing, and Mark Andreessen may think something else, and Peter Thiel may think something else, and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos may think other kinds of things, and they're all going to be tugging at his sleeve, going this way or that. And by the way, I think we ought to be fair. In some respects, I'm glad they are, because Elon Musk, wrong about many things, dangerous in many ways, is right about H-1B visas. And it's better to have him tugging at the sleeve of the president than some nut job right winger who says no immigration. All immigrants are bad, right? So they're gonna nudge him a little bit in the right direction. But how do you think that this contest is going to play out? Because a bunch of them are, as you pointed out in the article that I was talking about, don't regulate it, leave it to us, we got this. The traditional Silicon Valley take on this whole thing. Some of them are, well, they're these existential issues. Focus on that. Maybe it'll keep you preoccupied from focusing on the stuff that'll impact our business, and so on. How do you think this cage match around Trump is going to play out?
Well, I think there are huge differences. Remember, some of these are privately held firms, some of them are publicly held firms. Some are accountable to their stakeholders, including their employees. And so let's just take Meta as an example. He had his quarterly report recently where, he talked about the direction related to AI and XR. And then he had an employees meeting where he said, we're not abandoning DEI, we're just reframing it. Now, that might be bullshit, but I work with people at Meta. They certainly have not abandoned participatory AI, which is an AI development strategy designed to try to make AI more representative at every level. So, I'm just, some of this is talk, but they also produce different products and they have different needs and different futures. But I don't really think they're that influential, to tell you the truth. They're visible. And to me, that visibility was Trump saying, see, rich people really think I'm smart. But the truth is, when he puts the tariff on, and he cannot resist that because he only gets bullying, and tariffs are his favorite thing, his Swiss Army knife. Tariffs, I think people misunderstand what that's about. And I know you asked a different question, but let me just briefly say this. They're about power. They're about saying who wins and who loses. And he cannot resist using a tool that gives him that power, no matter how unaccountable and tyranny that is. I think that will be his breaking point. His cult will remain, but the bulk of Americans are going to find that very disturbing. And they're going to look at the technocracy and blame them. These guys should be concerned about winning our trust and finding new ways. Tim Cook might be an example of how someone's trying to go through that maze and might be successful, although there's a lot of dissing of Apple's AI, but that's a different subject. So that's my long-winded thing.
No, I think it's really, really important. And I think terms like tech bro suggest a monolithic group, and they're not monolithic. The fact that there are billionaires suggests that they have great mastery over a lot of subjects. They don't have a lot of mastery over a bunch of subjects. They also have some strange self-interests, like cryptocurrencies and things like that, which are, you know, doors to nowhere that, that lead to potential disaster. And we don't know. We don't know how the game is going to play out with Trump in terms of who ends up with the most influence or the least as he goes from being the oldest president to enter office to being an 82-year-old guy. And, what's he thinking about when he's at the end of his term? We don't know how that's going to play out. Um, uh, and so, this is, to me, fascinating, and we've got to drill down on it more. And hopefully, you and Luca, your cat, can come back at some point in the future and talk about these things again. I could have a whole conversation about the trade policy side of
Let's
these
do
things, but
that because next week is going to be extremely scary.
yeah. Well, I'll pass along to you before we wrap up here my own personal view, which
Yeah.
is I agree with your analysis, the psychological analysis of why Trump likes tariffs. But my own personal view is um, tariffs are playing a different role here. Trump wants to do a big tax cut. And in order to do a big tax cut, he wants to be able to tell people he's getting revenue from someplace and he's creating savings in someplace. He can't create the savings he wanted to. And so tariffs allow him to create this notion, which is complete bullshit, that the rest of the world is going to give us all this revenue. And we can use that revenue instead of the income tax revenue. And so we can give big tax cuts to a lot of billionaires. I think his theory of the game is he institutes the tariffs. They may cause some problems. He'll get the tax cut implemented in the next 6 months. And then he's going to negotiate a bunch of deals out of the tariffs because they're going to hurt too many people. And he thinks he can just move on from that. I don't see it as a long-term strategy. And frankly, I've talked to a lot of people from a lot of governments around the world that are like, okay, he's going to do that. This is negotiation. He's going to introduce this. And then we're going to come back with retaliation and he's going to rumble. And then we're going to end up at some place. And in the case of some relationships like China, at least it's talking. We didn't do talking before. In the case of other relationships, it won't be. Anyway, that's a subject for another day. You are very kind to have joined us. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope people follow your work. It's really important. And we'll be here each and every week with Scylla Consciousness, and starting in 2 weeks with our AI, Energy, and Climate podcast, as well as all our other podcasts. So join us here at the DSR Network for that. For now, thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye-bye.